growth happens exponentially. You grow very quickly from the beginning, and then it starts to taper off as the growth kind of hits maturity. All right? And that's an issue that's oftentimes avoided in terms of the way licensing is thought about and to what's accepted about how big these firms can actually be. There is a point at which they reach maturity and slow down in their growth.
Right, on that point, maturity, we want to slow it down a minute and just go back to some lessons from the legendary Scottish economist, not Gordon Brown, that was last year's legendary Scottish economist, but Adam Smith and the Invisible Hand, back to the 1700s. And you go through what he taught us and you'd be asking these intuitive questions. Again, 2 years ago in Brussels, we probably weren't thinking like this. In Washington, I'm already seeing it in the panels today. The first question is, at what level do these startup sites, which are gaining all of this hysteria, reach their maturity? I mean, what's the population? You know, they're not going to get to all 60 million people in the UK. They're going to get to a portion of them. Some have reached 1 million users so far. Perhaps they're a third of the way there to where they're going to mature out with 3 million people. You know, that's plausible. So that's an interesting question to ask, is at what point do you start to level off on your traction with the public? But once you've asked that question, you've got to go and think about where's the scarcity and where's the constraint. Back to that invisible hand of the market. Once you've matured, how do you then compete with existing incumbents? And go back to that point. Let's say a startup gets 3 million people in the UK, and it's competing for, you know, people and advertising dollars. You know, there are lots of sites and lots of incumbents that can get to 3 million people. Several breakfast morning radio shows reach more than 3 million people. Lots of TV channels reach more than 3 million sets of eyes and more than 3 million sets of ears. It's 3 million, not that big a number, but we get into this hysteria about these digital startups. We forget to put it into context. And then finally, you know, once you've reached your maturity, how do you then compete? How do the incumbents who have those users then respond to this new competition? Okay, they're not going to watch their marketing budgets be grabbed by some digital startup. They're going to compete with new commissions, new content to win those advertising budgets back again. You know, while you get these new schools of thought, one thing that I've learned from this and from the long tail work is that the old rules of the game still apply. And it's not to say, you know, for better or worse, it's just not going to be the land of milk and honey that we might have believed a couple of years ago. Okay, so just coming back down to earth, some raw economics. But that's not our problem, right? I mean, one attitude we could take is, it's my copyright, and if you can't pay the price, you can't have it. And we know the problems of piracy and that people can get it anyway, but that could be one attitude to have. And there's an argument for that. You know, it's a monopoly right, it's your creative right. But this is our problem, which is this. Here's the recorded music revenues in America from 1990 to 2008. If you look at where that last bar is, it kind of feels like 1992 in nominal terms before you adjust for inflation. Almost. And the same thing's happening in the UK. The size of the recorded music industry in the UK has shrunk back to its 1994 level, which is when Oasis did their gig at King Tut's Wild Wild Heart as an unsigned band, in nominal terms, before you adjust for inflation. And cost bases tend to rise with inflation.
So for a moment, let's return back to sort of this risk-reward debate, this kind of tension that plays out. And it's clearly playing out as sort of an us versus them mentality, quite frankly. There's a conflict that's in place. So this issue of equity, whether you agree with it or not, is really about, is there a way to go from this kind of imbalance, off this sort of balance in risk-reward, towards some sort of deal? And what would that deal have to look like? In some cases, it may be equity. In some countries, they're trying to solve the problem by way of minima, where sort of the tension is relieved by way of that. And that's, you know, where the PRS would like to have some comments.
Yeah, I mean, this is the point, is if you have minima, you approach equity questions and come out with different answers than if you don't, all right? You know, for equity, read minima, and vice versa. So we wanted to raise this issue here, which is the announcement the PRS made just a matter of weeks ago, and look at the language of the announcement, which is the trade-off, and we've talked already about trade-offs, a reduction in the per-stream minima for an increase in the headline royalty rate. Okay, so that was our big announcement a couple of weeks ago. Just to clarify what the numbers are, we reduced the minima from 0.22 to 0.085, but, and some people overlook this point, we increased the revenue share from 8% to 10.5%, which is broadly similar to other revenue shares that you'll see around other territories. So, you know, particularly for those who don't have minima, and fingers crossed on your abilities to get it, you might be asking, why did you do it? Okay. And we just want to go through this in step by step because it, again, for equity, read minima, for minima, read equity, there are three reasons why it's done. Firstly, recognition that the markets change. We're not saying the tribunal decision in 2007 was wrong, But the market has changed since then, and it's changed in the direction of streaming services. That brings with it evidence, and evidence brings with it a better understanding about what does it take to make the market work. So that was the first part. The second part was consultation. You know, we had consulted with 25 different rights users representing the vast chunk of our revenue with this new evidence that we had to hand that we didn't have then, and realized that, sure, whilst there's new markets coming in, new companies starting up, the ones who were there were either stalling or exiting. So it didn't bode well. Something just wasn't quite right. And thirdly, the intention, and back to that hare-tortoise trade-off, what is your intention here? I mean, this is a tough call for us, reducing minimum or increasing revenue. This is a big decision. But I think behind that decision is an understanding that if I help you today, you're going to help me tomorrow. And the intention is clear, to allow our creators to participate in these new legal forms of consuming music.
So for those of you who might be like me and you understand the world only in terms of pictures, essentially, in simpler terms, there was kind of this recognition that this perception of what royalties might be and where revenues really were, there was a gap. And there was a big gap, small gap, undetermined. But the gap needed to be dealt with. So they lowered the floor, essentially lowering in the short term the amount of the per rate minima with the intent that it would to stoke up revenue growth. So by allowing firms to kind of use cash to grow as opposed to use cash to always pay out, they could grow more quickly such that in the long term there would be larger revenue base in the longer term. And it's a complicated issue, but it's very important to kind of think about releasing that tension so that these firms can grow and get to a point where the revenue is actually intriguing and not just something we talk about that might happen someday. So could rights societies pursue equity? Beyond the should, could you, quite frankly, given your management, the membership, and the regulation? That's, a big issue given.
Well, let's extend this a minute. Let's think about territoriality. Equity, by its nature, is global. Societies are territorial. Similarly, how would you distribute revenues from equity? There's questions to be asked there. Thirdly, membership changes. That's a big issue. Fourth, non-discrimination for a not-for-profit non-discrimination organization. Does it work? And finally, and one of the big bugbears for me is this conflict of interest. If I have an equity stake in a user, how does that mean I can represent my holder? So these are further questions which you can discuss with the Q&A as well.
Yeah, there's a can of worms with this subject, which I think we understood but didn't understand in completeness. But since there are two economists on the stage, if you've ever dealt with economists, two economists will equate to at least three opinions. So and our three opinions for this, should rights societies pursue equity question?
Well, I'm going to argue no, okay? And the reason why I'm going to argue no is as follows. Want to click it on?
Oh, yeah.
So it's just this ugly trend I'm seeing in the music business just now of transparency levels are falling, and therefore friction is increasing. And you go back to the Featured Artists Coalition, that's happened. For better or for worse, you've got to recognize it's happened, and it's going to happen elsewhere. People want to know how they're going to get paid.
And I'd be more inclined perhaps to say yes, which perhaps doesn't surprise anybody. But the problem is that equity, if it's done well and done thoughtfully, it could actually relieve a lot of that tension, given it's very difficult to price these startups far in advance from their maturity. Alternatively, realizing the fact that I don't think the problem is that equity doesn't ultimately make sense, but it would be very difficult for entities operating in this right side to make sense of equity. It involves a very different way of thinking about how to structure deals. It's a mindset that those of us from the startup community just kind of naturally gravitate towards, but it's also risky and hard to understand. And we're not unaware of the fact that it's not a simple language. So I think that, yes, it's plausible and it does make sense, but it would be very difficult to pull off in the midterm. But some of you may actually just be completely on the fence. You won't even go on either side. You'll just say, well, maybe. The issue is just so complicated, and it requires so much more thought and discussion that we really can't even have an answer in the near term. But ultimately, it's about sustainability.
Yeah, we can't lose sight of this word. I mean, how do we develop a sustainable future for creators to create and startups to start up and the money to flow as it did in the old world? We can't lose sight of that. That's the role of a collecting society, okay? Connecting the rights holder and the rights user for a sustainable future for the music business.
So like a well-made play, we'll end where we began, if those of you who are familiar with French plays. Should rights societies pursue equity? I don't know. That's the point to discuss here. So thank you.
Thank you very much.